What if I told you a tiny tube of spit could never tell the real story of who you are? It sounds like science fiction, but it's exactly what some US policies have been pushing. During the Trump administration, federal agencies floated the idea that DNA tests could help determine who is really Native American. On the surface, it seems simple: spit in a tube, wait a few weeks, get a certificate of authenticity. But identity isn't something you download from a lab report. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Tribal identity has never been about genetics alone. Long before DNA kits existed, Native nations defined membership based on kinship, shared history, cultural responsibility, and community recognition. Enrollment forms, blood quantum calculations, and government roles like the infamous DOS rolls were imposed externally, often cutting families apart, erasing histories, and creating divisions that still echo today. Blood quantum, a measure of native blood expressed as fractions, was a policy tool created by outsiders, not tribes. It was meant to limit the number of people recognized as native and to encourage assimilation. The Dawes rolls, completed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, recorded individuals for allotment purposes, but many families were excluded or miscategorized, often because officials didn't understand tribal lineage or language. Fast forward to today, DNA tests promise objective proof, but they reduce culture and community to a sequence of base pairs. You can have the genetic markers of a Cherokee or Lakota ancestor, but if you were raised outside the community, never spoke the language, never participated in traditions, the tribe may not recognize you. In other words, a test can tell you ancestry, but it can't tell you about belonging. This isn't just academic. For real tribal communities, these policies aren't neutral. They determine access to health care, education, and land rights. Outsiders trying to claim identity based on DNA risk diluting culture and creating legal and social conflicts within communities. So if you like seeing bureaucracy fight culture, like it's a WWE match, hit subscribe, slap that like button like it owes you money, and comment your thoughts because sharing this video is legally mandatory according to no one. But do it anyway. Remember, real identity isn't in a vial. It's in families, traditions, languages, and the communities that sustain them. What if a simple spit test promised to tell you who you are, but couldn't? That's exactly the illusion behind DNA tests and native identity. These kits can tell you percentages of ancestry: 25% Cherokee here, 12% Lakota there, but that's where the story stops. DNA can measure ancestry. It cannot measure belonging. Tribal membership, community ties, lived experience, none of that comes in a tube. For centuries, native nations have defined identity differently from the federal government or private labs. It's not about fractions or sequences, it's about kinship, responsibility, and shared history. Being recognized as native by your nation means participating in cultural traditions, speaking the language, being part of a community that remembers your ancestors and carries their legacy. A DNA test cannot capture that. Here's a simple example. Someone might have 25% native DNA but never be accepted by a tribe because they were raised outside the community or have no connection to its practices. On the flip side, a person with no measurable native DNA could be fully recognized by a nation, fully participating in ceremonies, raising their children in the culture, and being entrusted with the responsibilities of membership. Identity, in this sense, is lived, not measured. The human impact is real and sometimes painful. There are documented cases of individuals who are challenged by bureaucracies or distant relatives, even though their communities had always recognized them. One woman's family had been enrolled in a tribe for generations. Yet when she submitted a DNA kit to prove her heritage, skeptics dismissed her because her numbers didn't meet their arbitrary expectations. Stories like hers highlight the danger of reducing culture and belonging to a spreadsheet of genetic percentages. This is not theoretical. It affects access to resources, healthcare, education, and legal rights within tribal nations. Outsiders using DNA as proof risk diluting cultural authority and creating tension inside communities that have preserved their identity for centuries. The takeaway is simple. DNA might tell you where your ancestors came from, but it cannot tell you who you are. Real native identity is forged through family, culture, responsibility, and recognition by the communities that live it every day. One small tube of spit cannot replace centuries of lived history. Now let's move from the lab to Washington. Between 2019 and 2020, federal discussions intensified around tightening identity verification in certain tribal and immigration-related contexts. In particular, DNA testing began appearing more prominently in conversations about federal recognition, citizenship verification, and benefit eligibility. While not universally mandated across all tribes, the growing emphasis on genetic proof signals something deeper, a shift toward bureaucratic control over identity. The Bureau of Indian Affairs (BIA), the federal agency responsible for relationships with tribal nations, has long required documentation for federal recognition. That process already demands extensive historical records, genealogical proof, and political continuity. But proposals for stricter evidentiary standards combined with public rhetoric around DNA testing raised alarms in Indian country. Why? Because tribal sovereignty means tribes determine their own membership. Not Congress, not the buyer, not a commercial DNA company. Sovereignty is not symbolic, it is legal and constitutional. Tribal nations are recognized as distinct political entities with the authority to define citizenship based on their own laws, traditions, and constitutions. When the federal government leans toward genetic proof as validation, it risks overriding that authority. And this is where the tension became real. For some communities, there was fear that shifting federal standards could eventually affect funding, land status, or recognition eligibility. Federal recognition determines access to health care through the Indian Health Service, education funding, housing programs, and jurisdictional authority over land. If identity standards change at the federal level, the consequences are not abstract, they are economic, legal, and generational. Elders, many of whom remember the termination policies of the 1950s, when the federal government attempted to dissolve tribal status entirely, saw troubling echoes. Families who had always been recognized within their communities suddenly faced questions framed in bureaucratic language rather than cultural understanding. Imagine being an elder who has served on tribal council, spoken your language your entire life, buried relatives on tribal land, and being told that a lab result might someday weigh more than your lived history. This is not just about paperwork. It is about power. When identity shifts from community recognition to federal verification, sovereignty weakens. And for native nations, sovereignty is survival. Because once the government decides who counts, it also decides who doesn't. And history shows us how dangerous that can be. But here's what often gets overlooked. Tribes didn't stay silent. As federal conversations around DNA verification gained attention, Native leaders across the country made one thing clear: tribal citizenship is not determined by commercial genetics. It is determined by tribal law. Nations like the Cherokee Nation, Navajo Nation, and many others have long established enrollment systems grounded in historical documentation, community lineage, and constitutional governance. Some rely on descent from individuals listed on historical rolls, such as the Dawes rolls. Others use lineal descent without blood quantum requirements. Many incorporate oral history, kinship networks, and community recognition into how identity is understood and maintained. And that distinction matters. DNA testing can suggest distant ancestry, but tribes defined citizenship politically and culturally, not racially. Tribal citizenship is not a race category. It is a legal relationship between an individual and a sovereign nation. That's why many tribal leaders pushed back strongly against the idea that a lab could override a nation's constitution. Cherokee Nation leaders, for example, have publicly emphasized that tribal citizenship is based on documented descent from an ancestor listed on specific historical rolls, not DNA percentages. The Navajo Nation has similarly maintained that its membership rules are defined by its own laws, including blood quantum standards established by the tribe itself, not by outside agencies or private companies. One tribal leader put it plainly during public debate: "Our identity is not something you purchase in a kit. It is something you inherit through responsibility, history, and community." That statement carries emotional weight, but it also carries legal authority. Because when tribes defend their right to determine membership, they are defending sovereignty itself. For many Native families, this fight is deeply personal. Grandparents who preserved language through boarding school eras. Parents who fought for treaty rights. Young people learning traditions today. All of them understand that identity is more than ancestry, it is continuity. If identity becomes a genetic threshold defined externally, then tribal nations lose control over their own citizenship. And history has shown what happens when that control slips away. So tribes pushed back not against science, but against reduction. Because DNA may trace bloodlines, but only a nation can define its people, and that line, for Native communities, is not negotiable. This debate isn't really about DNA kits. It's about who holds the power to define identity. When identity is reduced to a genetic percentage, culture becomes a statistic. Community becomes optional. Sovereignty becomes negotiable. And that shift carries consequences far beyond politics. For Native nations, identity has always been relational. It is tied to land, language, ceremony, and responsibility to future generations. It is about who shows up, who participates, who carries the stories forward. DNA cannot measure that continuity. When governments or institutions prioritize genetics over community recognition, it quietly reframes identity as biological instead of political. But tribal citizenship is not a racial category. It is a legal and sovereign status recognized in treaties, federal law, and the U.S. Constitution. That distinction protects real rights. Federal recognition determines access to land protections, health care through the Indian Health Service, education programs, housing support, and jurisdictional authority. These are not symbolic benefits. They are structural safeguards rooted in treaty obligations agreements made between sovereign nations. If identity standards shift toward DNA alone, it risks weakening the political foundation of those agreements. Because once citizenship is treated as ancestry instead of nationhood, treaty rights can be reframed as racial entitlements rather than sovereign commitments. History shows how dangerous that narrative can become. And beyond the legal framework, there's something deeper. Heritage is not a hobby. It is inheritance. For many Native families, grandparents survived boarding schools designed to erase language and culture. Parents fought for religious freedom protections. Entire communities worked to preserve traditions that federal policy once tried to eliminate. Reducing that survival story to a percentage on a lab report strips away its human weight. This isn't anti-science. DNA testing has value in genealogy and medical research. But science cannot replace sovereignty, and it cannot substitute for living belonging. So when we talk about DNA and native identity, we're not discussing a technical policy tweak. We're watching a larger tension unfold: culture versus paperwork, community versus bureaucracy, nationhood versus classification. And this matters today because the way a society defines identity shapes who belongs, who has rights, and who gets erased. This isn't abstract. It's about real people, real nations, and promises that were meant to last generations. So after everything we've covered, here's the bottom line. If you thought a DNA kit could tell you everything about your past, well, now you know it can't. Science can trace migration patterns. It can estimate ancestry percentages. It can even connect distant relatives. But it cannot define sovereignty. It cannot measure belonging. And it cannot replace the authority of a nation to determine its own citizens. This conversation is bigger than politics. It's bigger than one administration. It's about how identity is framed in modern society. Are we just data points, just percentages on a report? Or are we members of living communities shaped by responsibility, history, and shared memory? For Native nations, the answer has always been clear. Citizenship is not purchased. It is not downloaded. It is not assigned by a private company's algorithm. It is recognized through law, community, and continuity. And when that authority is challenged even subtly, it matters. Because once identity becomes something measured only in biology, culture begins to lose its voice. And history shows what happens when governments define identity without listening to the people who live it. That's why this topic deserves attention. Not outrage, not hype, but understanding. If this video challenged what you thought you knew, that's a good thing. Real learning is uncomfortable sometimes. It forces us to rethink simple answers to complicated histories. And now, let's keep it real for a second. If you have that one friend who trusts their ancestry kit more than their grandmother's stories, send this video to them. Respectfully, kindly, but firmly, they need this perspective. Like the video if you value culture over paperwork. Comment your thoughts because conversations like this matter. And subscribe if you want more tight, factual, human-centered historical breakdowns without the noise. Because identity isn't a trend. It's history, it's law, it's survival, and it deserves more than a percentage on a screen.